If you look at the EU urban policy, one of the interesting results is that when you study precisely the instruments being used, you can show that there was no autonomy in the choice of instruments. Basically, the guys defending the regional policy did not want an urban policy. They were obliged to accept that. But the instruments were the same one than the regional policy. So there was never an autonomy in terms of instruments. So in a way, and the policy was marginalized. In a way, you could argue that the institutionalization of a policy and the long-term development of a policy and the success of the innovation in policies also depends on the capacity to create original combinations of policy instruments with a strong autonomy. It's a conclusion coming from one case, but it's quite an interesting conclusion, we think, that we would like to see in different ways. A third example I would like to really emphasize is the fact that by using this sort of methodology, it's extremely interesting to look at the circulation and migration of policy instruments. When you think about where do innovations come from, you can really relate exactly to the sociology of innovation. And you can see how strategic actors use one instrument from one sector, then bring it back at the EU level, then it's coming down at the national level, then it moves to another sector. There are not so many new policy instruments we find in the public policy we study. We see lots of hybridization, classic term. We see lots of adaptation at the margin and circulation up, down, and horizontally. So, a crazy research project would be to try to identify all EU policies over 50 years with massive, huge database, and then following all the instruments, would be fantastic. Impossible, too much work. We can't do that. But maybe sometimes we do that. And as I said, what is important is really to not concentrating on new policy instrument. In many ways, the lesson we derive here is, yes, in order to be serious to understand innovation in policy instruments and the impact on ways of governance, you really have to combine with your various layers of the cake and see where these things are coming from. The serious innovations of like new policy instruments is pretty rare. Most of the time it's import, export, hybridations, little change at the margin, much in public policy. That's really the logic of the game. I would also emphasize the fact that there's an illusion of new policy instruments being nice, democratic, innovative, consultation, people being nice and all that. Of course, no. And in the study we do, we can see how the effect of various policy instruments introduced in the name of nice, consultative democracy, in fact, are extremely well designed to maximize minimum participation, as Paul Hurst used to say in the UK. And we see a lot about that. And that's what I probably want to conclude on that, is that when you really want to emphasize these innovations in policy instruments, and by using these techniques, we are able to show over 30 years some clearly structural change on which instruments are used in a more or less systematic way. And it tells us a lot about different ways to govern society. I tend to argue, and that's my last line, that when you try to, and that's just speculation, but I try to argue at the moment that the two main modes of governance which seem to emerge from our database, which is something that Guy Peters is playing with at some point as well, is that on the one hand, we see, I will use Giorgio's idea of left hand of the state, we see more and more instruments to try to govern by consensus, by mobilizations of various groups, by consultation, by trying to get more democracy in public decisions in various sorts of ways. And at the same time, and more or less importantly, I don't know, what we also see is more and more government and governance by indicators, technique, and very strongly used and mobilized for re-centralization. And I think we see the two things at the same time in a number of policy, which I would call the right hand of the state. Thank you very much.